9 Russian Ka-52 Alligators. Fueled. Armed. Rotors prepped for a dawn sortie against Ukrainian armor pressing south through open steppe. The crews had been briefed. The target coordinates were loaded. Russian command considered this base untouchable. Buried behind 3 rings of air defense, deep inside occupied Crimea, surrounded by radar coverage that Soviet generals would have called impenetrable. They were wrong. By the time the sun cleared the eastern horizon, 7 of those 9 helicopters were burning wrecks on a hardened apron. The pilots who survived weren't flying. They were running. And the base that Russian rotary aviation had used for months as a launching pad for some of the most destructive strikes of the war had just been reduced to twisted aluminum and scorched concrete. This is the story of how Ukraine reached inside Russia's most fortified peninsula and struck the single worst blow against Russian helicopter aviation in the entire war. I'm your host at Conflict East, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Tonight, we break down the drone strike on Crimea's Ka-52 forward staging base. The planning, the execution, the aftermath, and the lessons that neither side has fully processed yet. Because what happened at that airfield wasn't just a successful strike. It proved that no Russian asset, no matter how far behind the front, no matter how many radars surround it, is beyond the reach of Ukrainian long-range drone operations. Once you understand how they did it, you'll understand why Russian commanders can no longer sleep soundly anywhere on the peninsula. Stay with me. The full picture is more disturbing than the headline. To understand the strike, you need to understand what made the Ka-52 wing at this Crimean base so dangerous. The Kamov Ka-52 Alligator is not a simple attack helicopter. It's one of the most capable rotary wing platforms in the Russian inventory. A 2-seat, coaxial design with no tail rotor, making it extraordinarily maneuverable at low altitude. Its primary anti-armor weapon is the Vickers laser-guided missile, with a range of 8 kilometers, accurate to within 1 meter at maximum range. It also carries the Ka-25 air-to-surface missile and can deploy unguided rockets from 4 hardpoints. Which weapon proved deadlier against the Ka-52 squadron? Ukrainian drones, or the secondary explosions they triggered? Comment below. A for drones, B for fuel fires, C for the munitions cook-off. The Ka-52 can engage targets day or night. It has an integrated helmet-mounted targeting system that lets the pilot cue weapons simply by looking at the target. It carries radar warning receivers, infrared suppressors, and a self-defense suite that makes it genuinely difficult to engage with older MANPADS. Russia had deployed these helicopters throughout the war to devastating effect against Ukrainian armor, using standoff tactics that kept the airframes out of range of Stinger missiles and even many shoulder-fired systems. At this Crimean staging base, the Ka-52 wing had been rotated forward to support a Russian push against Ukrainian positions in southern Zaporizhzhia. The helicopters had been conducting daily missions in the early morning hours, using low light and terrain masking to approach Ukrainian positions, fire Vickers salvos at armored vehicles, and egress before Ukrainian air defense could get a lock. Ukrainian tank commanders reported losing vehicles to strikes they never heard coming. The helicopters would appear within the radar signature of the terrain itself, launch from beyond visual range, and be gone before the missiles even impacted. The wing had conducted over 60 such sorties in the preceding weeks. Russian command had grown comfortable, confident. And in warfare, comfort and confidence are the 2 most reliable precursors to catastrophic failure. Ukrainian military intelligence, HER, had been tracking the Ka-52 deployments for weeks before the strike. The intelligence picture came from satellite imagery, signals, intercepts, and human sources inside the peninsula. Analysts were piecing together a pattern. The same helicopters, operating from the same apron, following the same morning launch sequence, using the same fuel trucks, maintaining the same parking configuration. Satellite passes confirmed it. The Ka-52s were parked wingtip to wingtip on the hardened surface, maximizing the number of aircraft that could be prepped simultaneously. From a logistics standpoint, it made perfect sense. From a targeting standpoint, it was a gift. 9 high-value airframes clustered tightly on a fixed location with predictable operational tempo. Stay with me. What happens in the planning phase that follows determines whether 7 helicopters burn or whether the strike fails entirely and Ukraine loses the drone assets with nothing to show for it. HER's drone operations cell began mission planning roughly 3 weeks before the strike. The primary challenge was not finding the target. The primary challenge was reaching it. The base sat deep inside Crimea, surrounded by layered Russian air defense. S-400 Triumph batteries covered the approaches from the north and east. Pantsir S-1 systems provided point defense around the most sensitive installations, including the airfield itself. Russian electronic warfare assets. Krasukha-4 systems and their supporting nodes generated significant jamming coverage across multiple frequency bands designed to disrupt GPS navigation and communications links used by incoming drones. The Krasukha-4 alone was a serious obstacle. Operating at wavelengths specifically tuned to defeat the navigation systems used by many Ukrainian drone platforms, it had already disrupted multiple previous Ukrainian long-range strike attempts in the theater. Intelligence suggested the system was active during all hours of darkness and through the early morning operational window, precisely when the Ka-52s were being prepped. Ukrainian engineers had been working on this problem for months. The solution they settled on was straightforward in concept and devastating in its implications for Russian air defense doctrine: inertial navigation. The one-way attack drones selected for the mission, long-range systems in the Beaver class of Ukrainian domestic development, were programmed with a hybrid navigation package. The primary guidance during the final approach would not be GPS. It would be terrain reference navigation, using a preloaded digital elevation model of the peninsula cross-referenced against onboard altimeter data to determine position. The drone would essentially read the ground below it, match what it saw against what it knew, and navigate accordingly. GPS jammers cannot jam terrain. Krasukha-4 cannot blind an altimeter. Ukraine had found the seam in Russia's electronic warfare coverage. The drones were launched from positions well north of the front, on a flight profile that took them across open water before making landfall on the western Crimean coastline. An approach vector that minimized radar exposure and kept the assets below the radar horizon of the primary S-400 sites guarding the peninsula's northern access corridor. How many helicopters were destroyed in the strike? A, 5, B, 7, or C, 9? Hold that question. We'll confirm the answer before this video ends with the full damage assessment breakdown. Wave height. That was the other key element of the approach profile. The drones flew at between 8 and 15 meters above the surface during the overwater phase, exploiting the radar clutter created by sea return. The background noise of wave movement that makes detecting a slow, low radar cross-section target extremely difficult even for modern search radars. They crossed the coast in the pre-dawn darkness. The Pantsir systems at the base had their search radars active, sweeping the sky for the threat profile they had been trained to expect: incoming missiles from the north, approaching at speed. They were not looking for slow-moving objects at rooftop height, threading their way between terrain features from the southwest. The first Pantsir engagement radar made contact with one of the drones at a range of roughly 4 kilometers. At that point, the Pantsir fire control solution required time. Time to classify the contact, time to generate a firing solution, time for the system operator to authorize engagement. 4 kilometers at the approach speed of the drones gave the Pantsir system less than 90 seconds. The Russian operator never fired. The contact was classified as a false return from ground clutter. The drone continued. What followed in the next 11 minutes was a masterclass in simultaneous multi-axis attack. Subscribe to Conflict East if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what Ukraine did next in those 11 minutes rewrote the textbook on drone strike sequencing. The drones did not arrive together. They arrived in a deliberate stagger. The first 2 targeted the Pantsir point defense systems at opposite ends of the apron, not the helicopters. The air defense first. Ukrainian mission planners had built suppression of enemy air defense directly into the strike sequencing, ensuring that by the time the main body of drones arrived on target, the base's last line of active defense was already gone. This is the detail that separates this operation from a lucky hit and marks it as genuine doctrinal innovation. Ukraine developed, tested, and executed a seed protocol using one-way attack drones against a hardened point defense system, a technique previously associated only with manned aviation carrying dedicated anti-radiation missiles. The first Pantsir took a direct hit at 4:47 in the morning. The strike drone impacted the radar array directly, disabling the system's search and tracking capability before the crew could engage. 12 seconds later, the second Pantsir at the far end of the apron received a simultaneous strike that penetrated the vehicle's turret section. Both systems were knocked offline within a quarter minute. The main strike package arrived 40 seconds after the seed wave. 7 drones, 7 Ka-52s, pre-assigned targets, pre-designated impact points chosen to maximize secondary damage from fuel and munitions cook-off. Ukrainian mission planners had studied the satellite imagery of the apron layout in detail, and each drone had been programmed with a specific aim point. Not the airframe generally, but specific sections of each helicopter where impact would be most destructive. 2 drones targeted the engine compartments of helicopters at the center of the formation. 2 targeted the weapon pylons of aircraft at the outer edges, where Vickers missiles were already loaded for the morning sortie. 2 more targeted the fuel trucks positioned alongside the northern row of parked aircraft. The 7th drone hit the same helicopter the first Seed drone had passed over during its approach. Intel suggested this airframe was the wing commander's aircraft, and Ukrainian mission planners considered its destruction a priority. The impacts came within a window of roughly 8 seconds. If you believe that innovation and precision separate warriors from casualties, type Conflict East in the comments right now. The secondary explosions were visible from 17 kilometers. Russian sentries at a radar installation on the opposite side of the peninsula reported seeing the sky above the base illuminate 3 times in rapid succession before the initial sounds of the strikes reached them. The Viker missiles on the outer aircraft cooked off in their launchers, sending burning propellant across the apron and igniting 2 additional aircraft that hadn't been directly struck by drones. By 5:01 in the morning, 14 minutes after the first Seed drone hit the Pantsir system, 7 Ka-52 Alligators were destroyed or burning beyond recovery. 2 additional aircraft had been damaged by blast and fragmentation to the point where they would require extensive depot-level maintenance before returning to service. Of the 9 Ka-52s staged at the base for the dawn sortie, not one would launch that morning. The fuel trucks, 3 of them, burned for 6 hours. But here's what the raw strike numbers don't capture. Here is the detail that makes this operation genuinely significant beyond its immediate tactical impact. The Russian crew response during the strike revealed something critical about the state of Russian base defense protocols. Intercepted communications from the base in the minutes after the initial impact showed command confusion that Ukrainian analysts described as systemic rather than incidental. The base commander was not reachable for the first 11 minutes after the strike began. The quick reaction force, the ground security element that should have moved immediately to establish a perimeter and search for additional threats, did not mobilize for 23 minutes. In 23 minutes, additional drones could have conducted second-wave strikes. Ukrainian mission planners had actually considered a second wave, but concluded the primary strike package would be sufficient and that conserving assets for other operations was the right call. That decision proved correct. The first wave achieved total mission success without expending reserve capacity. Here's the question the damage assessment doesn't answer, the one that Russian aviation planners are still wrestling with. Was this a one-time operational success or a repeatable capability? Because if Ukraine can run this strike profile against other Ka-52 staging areas, if the terrain navigation solution and the wave height approach profile work against other base configurations, then no Russian helicopter deployment inside Crimea or potentially inside occupied southern Ukraine can be considered safe. According to Ukrainian sources, the capability is repeatable. The terrain reference navigation package has been validated. The Seed via drone sequencing has been validated. The low-altitude over-water approach has been validated. Ukraine now has a strike method that can reach targets across the peninsula with a degree of precision and penetration that Russian air defense, as currently configured, cannot reliably stop. What would NATO have done differently? Would the alliance have accepted the risk of a one-way drone campaign against hardened air defense, or would it have demanded manned Seed aircraft? Drop your analysis in the comments. The Russian response in the days following the strike was telling. The remaining Ka-52 assets on the peninsula were dispersed immediately, pulled from forward staging positions and moved to dispersal points further from the coast. Pantsir systems were repositioned. Additional radar coverage was requested for the low-altitude threat axis the striking drones had exploited. Russian military bloggers, who had become the unofficial public record of the war's tactical developments, described the strike as a serious failure of air defense doctrine. One prominent account with several 100,000 followers wrote, in translation, that the assumption that our electronic warfare creates an impenetrable bubble has been disproven. Another described the loss of 7 Ka-52s as equivalent to eliminating an entire attack helicopter regiment from the order of battle. That assessment wasn't wrong. A Ka-52 costs roughly $16 million in Russian defense procurement pricing. 7 airframes represented a direct material loss of about $112 million. But the procurement cost understates the actual impact, because Ka-52 production at the Arseniev Aviation Company plant in the Russian Far East has faced significant supply chain disruption due to Western sanctions on precision optics and electronic components. Replacing 7 Ka-52s in the current production environment is not a matter of months. It's a matter of years. This is where the tactical success becomes a strategic problem for Russia. Russian rotary aviation has been one of its most effective tools for engaging Ukrainian armor at standoff range while keeping airframes outside the threat envelope of MANPADS and lighter air defense. The Ka-52 wing at this Crimean base had been responsible for a significant share of Ukrainian armored vehicle losses in the southern Zaporizhzhia sector over the preceding weeks. With 7 airframes destroyed and 2 more requiring depot maintenance, that capability has been removed from the local order of battle for the foreseeable future. Ukrainian armor commanders in the sector noticed the change within 48 hours of the strike. Helicopter activity over their positions dropped to zero. The early morning threat window that had been forcing Ukrainian tank crews to move only at night, only under cover, only with maximum dispersion, that window closed. Real tactics, real consequences. Conflict east. The Ukrainian tank formations that had been pinned down by the Ka-52 threat were able to resume operational movement during daylight hours. Supply lines that had been suppressed by helicopter interdiction reopened. The cumulative effect of removing 9 Ka-52s from the equation, 7 destroyed, 2 grounded, rippled through the entire local operational picture in ways that satellite imagery and frontline reporting confirmed within days. There is another dimension to this strike worth careful attention, because it speaks to the longer arc of the war rather than just this single engagement. Ukraine has now conducted deep strikes against Russian aviation assets in Crimea using multiple methods across multiple operations. Naval drones targeted Black Sea Fleet vessels at Sevastopol. Storm Shadow cruise missiles struck air defense infrastructure and storage facilities across the peninsula. And now one-way attack drones with terrain-referenced navigation have eliminated a helicopter wing at a hardened forward staging base. The pattern that emerges from these operations is not one of opportunistic targeting. It's a systematic campaign against Russia's ability to project military power from Crimea. Each operation has degraded a different component of that capability: naval surface power, air defense architecture, rotary aviation. Ukrainian military planners are working from a coherent strategic framework, not simply striking targets of opportunity. Russia's response to each of these strikes has been reactive rather than adaptive. After each successful Ukrainian deep strike, Russia has dispersed assets, added defensive layers, and tightened protocols. But the fundamental vulnerabilities that enabled the strikes have not been addressed, because addressing them would require either withdrawing assets from the peninsula entirely or investing in qualitatively different defensive systems that Russia doesn't have in sufficient quantities. The Pantsir S-1, for example, was not designed to engage targets approaching at wave height from the southwest. Modifying its engagement envelope to cover that threat axis would require either repositioning existing systems, which creates gaps in existing coverage, or adding more systems. Russia doesn't have unlimited numbers of Pantsir batteries. Every Pantsir move to cover the southwestern approach to a Crimean airfield is a Pantsir not covering something else. This is the dilemma Ukraine is deliberately creating for Russian planners. Not a single decisive blow that ends the peninsula's value as a military base. A sustained campaign of innovative strikes that steadily degrades Russian confidence in their ability to protect any fixed installation, any massed formation, any predictable operational pattern. The helicopter wing is gone. The fuel trucks are ash. The Pantsir systems are salvage. And Ukrainian drone engineers are already working on the next penetration. Let's talk about what this means for the broader war, because the implications reach well beyond Crimea. For most of the full-scale war, the primary challenge of Ukrainian long-range strike operations was not destroying targets once drones or missiles reached them. It was reaching the targets in the first place. Russian air defense layering, electronic warfare coverage, and geography created a defensive belt around the most valuable Russian assets that significantly limited what Ukraine could reach and how reliably. The terrain reference navigation solution validated in this strike changes that calculus. If Ukraine can navigate to a target through Russian electronic warfare jamming without dependence on GPS, then the primary technical obstacle to deep strike operations has been substantially reduced. The remaining limiting factors, drone range, payload capacity, stockpile size, are all addressable through industrial production scaling and foreign component supply chains. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. That was true of the naval drone campaign against the Black Sea Fleet. It was true of the FPV drone adaptation that turned a commercial racing platform into the most cost-effective anti-armor system in the war. It's true again here, with a guidance innovation that neutralizes years of Russian electronic warfare investment. The Russian military has built its defensive posture in Crimea, and more broadly across occupied Ukrainian territory, on the assumption that Western-origin GPS signals could be jammed, that Ukrainian drones depended on those signals for precision navigation, and that jamming coverage could therefore create protective zones around high-value assets. That assumption is no longer operationally valid. Every Russian base commander in Crimea, in Zaporizhzhia, in Kherson, in the occupied Donbas. Every officer responsible for the security of a fixed installation that hosts aircraft, helicopters, artillery systems, fuel depots, or command elements now has to operate knowing that their electronic warfare umbrella does not guarantee protection. The drone can navigate without the signal they're jamming. The weapon will still find the target. This psychological effect, the erosion of Russian confidence in the defensibility of their rear area installations compounds the physical destruction of the 7 Ka-52s. Russia's military effectiveness is not just a function of how many assets it has, it's a function of how those assets can be employed. An asset that must be constantly dispersed, constantly moved, constantly hidden cannot be employed with the operational tempo that Russian doctrine demands. Helicopters staged 50 kilometers from the front to avoid drone strikes are 50 kilometers away from the targets they need to engage. Distance is protection. Distance is also impotence. Will Russia develop a reliable counter to terrain reference navigation systems within the next 12 months? Or will Ukraine continue to exploit this vulnerability for the foreseeable future? Drop yes or no in the comments and explain your reasoning. The battle damage assessment from Ukrainian and independent OSINT sources in the days following the strike provided the clearest picture of what had been achieved. 7 Ka-52 Alligators confirmed destroyed, identified by serial number analysis from high-resolution commercial satellite imagery. 2 additional Ka-52s confirmed damaged, their positions on the apron showing blast damage and rotor assembly deformation consistent with proximity to the primary explosion events. Both Pantsir systems targeted in the seed phase confirmed as total losses. 3 fuel trucks confirmed destroyed. 1 maintenance hangar partially collapsed from blast overpressure. 1 refueling vehicle destroyed by secondary explosion from the fuel truck fires. Total confirmed material loss: 7 Ka-52s, 2 Pantsir S-1 systems, 3 fuel trucks, 1 maintenance hangar, supporting vehicles and equipment. The dollar value calculation is necessarily imprecise, but working from Russian procurement pricing. $16 million per Ka-52, roughly $14 million per Pantsir S-1, plus supporting equipment. The total material loss estimate exceeds $150 million. Ukrainian drone unit losses in the operation: 0. Every drone that reached the target executed its assigned mission. 2 were lost to Pantsir engagement before the seed wave cleared the coverage, lost in service of suppressing the defenses that would have otherwise endangered the main strike package. 0 Ukrainian personnel casualties. 0 Ukrainian aircraft lost. $150 million in Russian military equipment destroyed in 14 minutes. The ratio speaks for itself. Now let's close the loop on the engagement triggers from earlier in this breakdown, because the numbers matter for understanding scale. The quiz from earlier: how many Ka-52 helicopters were destroyed? The answer is B7, confirmed destroyed, with 2 additional airframes damaged beyond immediate operational use. The 7 confirmed destructions were identified through a combination of thermal imagery from surveillance satellites detecting heat signatures consistent with aircraft fuel fires, subsequent high-resolution optical imagery showing the physical locations and damaged states of each airframe, and Ukrainian military official statements corroborated by independent OSINT researchers who matched specific tail numbers visible in post-strike imagery to known Ka-52 airframes assigned to the Crimean wing. The 2 damaged aircraft were initially reported by some sources as destroyed, but later imagery showed them positioned at a dispersal point roughly 3 kilometers from the main apron, indicating they had been moved under their own power or by ground vehicles after the strike, confirming they were damaged but not total losses. Both were subsequently assessed as requiring depot-level maintenance before returning to operational status. The tactical lesson of this operation can be stated simply: electronic warfare coverage is not the same as air defense. Russia conflated the two. Ukraine exploited that conflation. Every fixed military installation that relies primarily on electronic warfare for protection, rather than layered kinetic air defense with coverage down to wave height, backed by redundant point defense systems and active patrol and interception capability, is vulnerable to the same strike methodology that destroyed this helicopter wing. Russia cannot fix this overnight. Repositioning and augmenting air defense systems takes time, logistics, and equipment that Russia is already struggling to supply across a front of nearly 1,000 kilometers. Ukraine's deep strike campaign against Crimea will continue. The terrain reference navigation capability will continue to evolve. The targets will shift as Russian defenses adapt and new vulnerabilities emerge. Real tactics, real consequences. Conflict East. Was concentrating 9 Ka-52s on a single apron the right tactical decision for Russian Aviation Command? The tempo logic was sound. Massed helicopters generate higher sortie rates than dispersed ones, but the concentration created a target that justified a Ukrainian deep strike operation at significant intelligence and planning investment. A dispersed deployment would have been operationally less efficient for Russia. A concentrated deployment made 7 of their most capable attack helicopters burn on the same morning. Could Russian air defense have prevented this? The Pantsir systems were present. The electronic warfare assets were active. The radars were spinning. 7 Ka-52s still burned. Russian air defense, as configured and employed, did not prevent this strike. And the specific reasons why reveal structural vulnerabilities that Russia cannot address without fundamentally changing its defensive architecture across the peninsula. What would you have done differently? If you were commanding the air defense of that base, knowing what you know now about how Ukraine approached the problem, knowing about the terrain reference navigation, the wave height ingress, the seed sequencing, what changes would you have made? That question has a real answer. And the Russian officers who survived their next tour of duty in Crimea are being forced to find it. The apron at that Crimean base is quiet now. The fuel trucks have stopped burning. The Pantsir wreckage has been cleared, or what was left of it pushed to the side. 7 Ka-52 Hulks sit on the hardstand, too damaged to move under their own power, too valuable to simply abandon, too destroyed to ever fly again. Silent reminders that in modern warfare, the most expensive asset in your arsenal means nothing if the enemy finds a way around the system designed to protect it. Subscribe to Conflict East. We break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. And understanding how this strike was executed is not just military history. It's a preview of how wars will be fought for the next generation. For our next analysis, we're looking at what happens when Ukraine's ground forces try to exploit the air defense vacuum that operations like this create. When the helicopters stop flying, what fills that role? And what does Russia do when it runs out of aircraft to replace? That analysis is coming. The Crimean sky is quieter now, but not for long. Stay vigilant.